Cyril Mychalejko is the editor-in-chief of the Bucks County Beacon. He has over 2 decades of journalistic experience. His work has appeared in the Bucks County Courier Times, The Intelligencer, Upside Down World, Common Dreams, TruthOut, and many other publications. Today, Cyril joins The Signal as a guest to reflect on the week that Charlie Kirk was killed, the disturbing history of Turning Point USA, the failure of the mainstream media to meet our authoritarian moment, and the role of the Beacon in these turbulent times. Cyril, it's so awesome to be talking with you here on The Signal today.
Hey, thanks, Kevin.
Now, before we kind of jump into the events, I do want to kind of acknowledge that your mom had just passed away. And I know that was obviously, and I want to know that, our sympathies are with you. And I'm glad you took some time to make sure that you took care of business, because that's family first, really what it comes down to. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry to hear about her passing.
No, I really appreciate that. And, you can never prepare, for the hole in your heart that a loss like that kind of leaves you. So thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, you bet. So, you're coming back. We're sitting here today really at what feels like a pivot point in our political culture, in with what's happening across the country. And that's with the killing of Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA. Now, we should preface this by saying it's not as if their political violence was not growing in this country before then. It was not as if this is unbelievable, because we also know that not long before there was an assassination of a Minnesota lawmaker and her husband. We saw on the same day that Charlie Kirk was killed, we saw outbreaks of gun violence and school shootings. So the kind of violence in the culture has been there. But I think that people have been concerned that the increasing context of divisiveness and extremism was leading in a direction towards political violence. And we could make a case for that was already underway, just not in as pointed as a form as we saw with the killing of Charlie Kirk. So before we assess a little bit where we are, one of the things that is important, I think, that readers and listeners to the show know is that this has been not new in Bucks County, and it's certainly been something that's been not new across the country. So for example, you have been covering Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk's work for quite some time. I think back in 2021, you wrote an article about how Turning Point USA was establishing chapters in the Penridge School District, and how that what started out as an organization that was in colleges, Turning Point USA was making inroads into high schools and into even kind of middle schools across the country. So maybe we can kind of start by kind of winding us back to that moment, and kind of from your vantage point, thinking back to your attention to Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA and what you're reporting on kind of back then, and why you were raising the flags about their work way back then.
Sure. So this goes back to my time before I started at the Bucks County Beacon, when I was writing a twice-a-month column for the Bucks County Courier Times, which was something that both shocked me that they invited me to do that, as well as a lot of liberals and progressives across the county. And so, after I did my, introductory column, which I had entitled Bucks County Has a Progressive Future, which kind of laid out, my background, as well as the current state of politics in Bucks County, I was approached by parents in Penridge who were really concerned that Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA was opening a chapter in Penridge High School. And this is something that the Courier, wasn't really covering, until I started writing about it. And so, they had been on my radar at the time, but I had never really done a deep dive into who they were and what they stood for, and what some of the actors were about. It was really troubling, after reading, a few hours of some of their own statements, or listening to their own statements out of their own mouths. There was reasons why these parents were concerned, and why school administrators, quite frankly, should have been more concerned and exercised a little bit more caution before greenlighting this student group. Now, that's not to say, and I want to be completely clear, that it's not that I don't think that there should be conservative or Republican student groups, right? Of course there should be, just like there should be Democrat or liberal or progressive groups in a high school, but what there shouldn't be is a group like Turning Point USA that had a long and well documented history of racism, bigotry, and white nationalism. And that's not just me saying that. That's groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti Defamation League, whose work is explicitly to document and warn communities about groups like Turning Point USA. So at the time, for example, the Florida field director and Juan Pablo Andrade, who was also American First policy advisor at the time, he went to a 2017 Student Action Summit for Turning Point USA and was recorded as saying, the only thing the Nazis didn't get right is they didn't keep going, right? You had the New Yorker reporting that same year, Turning Point USA's former national field director sent a text to a colleague saying that, quote, I hate Black people, I hate Blacks. And then there was in 2018, there was WhatsApp messages leaked from Turning Point USA's Florida International University chapter, which in my mind kind of gave a preview of the kind of culture that awaited Penridge High School students. These text messages showed a racist Pepe the Frog meme about Syrian refugees raping white women, as well as a joke about dressing up as ICE agents to grapple Latinas and deport them. Something that we're actually kind of seeing right now in real time, which is what is happening. So, Turning Point USA and, Charlie Kirk's legacy is something that, has been, very present in Bucks County. And you can be horrified and just outraged that someone like Charlie Kirk, or anyone for that matter, was assassinated for speaking their views. But, the problem that we're seeing is that, some people think that because of that, they need to whitewash who Charlie Kirk was and what Turning Point USA actually stood for.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this is the difficult ground to actually have the discussion on now, but it's at all of what's more important. How everything has been focused on Charlie Kirk as martyr, as quasi messiah, as a free speech hero, all this stuff that you see circulating on both mainstream media and kind of on the right. The point of that you were trying to raise the flags on at that point, right, was that look, this is the context that we need to know what's happening, going to be going on into our schools. And I think one of my favorite lines that you have in that piece is after you start going through these series of examples, you basically say, look, I could go on, but this column has a 700 word limit, right? And that's kind of part of the point. By it's not just a statement or two that was being made like flippantly offhanded by a couple people on the margins of the organization, but there was a pattern of that kind of practice happening within TPUSA and stuff that they were promoting fairly openly, right, in their forums. And really, that question comes in about the role that community-based journalism, whether progressive or not, has to the community. I mean, I'm not going to try to guess what was in people's mind when they said, "Yeah, we're going to approve this organization," but I could assume that probably most parents and most teachers and most administrators had no idea about this history of Turning Point USA, in part because nobody was reporting on it. It just seemed to be like a conservative group. And yet this is a well-funded, right, well-organized, far-right kind of organization designed to push really divisive kind of politics. And at the very least, it seems like those are the kinds of organizations that there should be at least community awareness of and discussion. Because here we are in a moment like this. And, for a lot of folks, this is the first time they're even finding out who these people are.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that at the time, the Anti-Defamation League actually attempted numerous times to speak to former Superintendent David Bolton,
That's a great point.
who's now in Centennial, and the former high school principal, Dr. Cashman. They called, and they just refused to call back. And then the group sent a certified letter in November 2019, which they also refused to answer. And what the later letter stated, among other things, was that TPUSA's links to extremist ideology and hate speech run counter to the values of inclusion and equal opportunity to which all public schools must adhere. So I'm not sure what the superintendent and school principal were thinking at the time. Why wouldn't they even engage, with a group like the Anti-Defamation League, which, had documented, this kind of like, extremist cultural rot that was infecting this group,
Hmm.
and which started at the top, quite frankly. And then I think that this is like a perfect example of, why local school board elections are so important
Yes.
because, at the time, there was a right wing school board whose values aligned, with Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA's. And, they had a disdain for any kind of transparency or accountability, which, regardless of your politics, should be some kind of shared value about governance.
That's a great point. That's a great, and I think it's the kind of stuff that we need to be having these conversations to be able to assess in moments like these. And so let's take us to this last week in the present now. I mean, it seems to me, or I'll put out my concerns. Right, my concerns are that we just saw, for example, Stephen Miller kind of basically openly say they're going to weaponize the federal government to go out and kind of like go after kind of quote unquote left wing terrorist organizations, for example. Right. And this is happening at the same time that we've seen the kind of mass militarization, of mass troops going in and arresting people at their workplaces in their communities, whether or not they're American citizens or not. We've seen where an uptick of what I would call state violence, right, of being executed in communities. And now there seems to be an uptick of these kind of far right organizations who kind of see this as their calling to get back into business. Organizations like the Oath Keepers, like the Proud Boys, and these folks who have been openly kind of writing about and kind of posting to both social media and on talk shows that now they need to reorganize in order to kind of help ferret out, right, these quote unquote extremists, while positioning themselves as somehow defenders of kind of American values and freedom of speech and so on. I mean, how are you making sense of this moment right now, and how are you seeing the kind of landscape moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite frankly a very dangerous moment that we're finding ourselves in because what we're seeing is that the GOP and, to a certain extent aided and abetted by, certain media outlets or writers are whitewashing and mythologizing, Charlie Kirk in order to weaponize this, tragic and horrible assassination in order to attack their political opponents, right? And you were just talking about like Stephen Miller. Like Stephen Miller has already said, as California Governor Gavin Newsom pointed out on social media, that the Democratic Party is a terrorist organization. So,
Right.
when they say they're going out after, left wing, quote unquote, left wing extremists, so called left wing extremists, or, these, terror networks, what they really mean is anyone to the left of MAGA who criticizes them and their oftentimes unconstitutional and oppressive actions.
100%. And so, for example, this is JD Vance just was the guest host of Charlie Kirk's podcast that came on, and Stephen Miller was on or there. So here's like this appearing in the latest episodes of the Charlie Kirk Show podcast, which was guest hosted by U.S. Vice President JD Vance. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller said that, quote, "We are going to use every resource we have at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout the government to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks and make America safe again for the American people. Quote, it will happen, and we will do it in Charlie's name," and Miller vowed. And this is something that was, in a piece that was published by The Beacon by Brett Wilkins. kind of going through and looking at how opposition to the Trump regime is now being turned into, say, anyone who opposes us is potentially in that camp of domestic terrorist. And they're saying explicitly, I mean, you're thinking about now you're bringing the right wing podcast sphere into the White House. Literally, that episode of the podcast was recorded in JD Vance's office, preaching out this kind of right wing ideology and saying we're going to weaponize the federal government to carry it out. That's frightening to me.
No, absolutely. And even more to that point is the fact that, the Department of Justice, and this is something that was just reported by 404 Media, they're taking the Orwellian steps of scrubbing former reports that were published, showing that by the DOJ, showing that the white supremacist and far right violence continues to outpace all types of terrorism and domestic violent extremism in the United States. So they're trying to create like a whole different reality where this one lone shooter whose politics are, we don't even really know what they are, that's still being sussed out. And never mind the fact that he came from like a conservative family. We do know that, but they're trying to create this false picture that there is a left wing domestic violence problem or domestic terrorism problem in the United States. When in fact, like, the numbers just say otherwise, and
Right.
they're just completely ignoring recent history, whether it was like the January 6th insurrection, which was in recent memory like one of the biggest acts of attempts of domestic terrorism that this country has faced. The Buffalo shooting massacre, which was white supremacist violence. The
Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Right, in Pittsburgh, right, which is, Governor Shapiro was just talking at an anti-extremism conference that started because of that. The shooting up of a black church in North Carolina. The list goes on. And then you're seeing like local actors, local MAGA mouthpieces like Dom Giordano, just so upset that Senator James Langford actually, to his credit, who is like a right-wing, conservative Christian Republican, saying that white nationalist violence is also a problem that we have to deal with.
Yeah.
And Dom Giordano, this local AM radio, Rush Limbaugh wannabe, just could not handle that simple fact, or that someone from his tribe, from his team, the Republican Party, to his credit, would actually be, honest enough to say, yes, like this is a problem that the right has to reckon with. Yeah, and this is where we find ourselves at, and it's dangerous. And like the mainstream media needs to be pointing this out, whether it's the Bucks County Courier Times or the Washington Post, which both have done less than stellar jobs on this front.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that one of the things that's increasingly frustrating when you're seeing how these narratives make their way into the media is that when very often is the case when you see right wing violence, right, that has taken place, what you see in that kind of right wing media sphere, and frankly, in a lot of kind of mainstream media spheres, is an attempt to look or kind of not attribute this to some sort of kind of like overarching political ideology, but rather they go out of their way to talk about this person as an individual. But then we see, again, I mean, there's only limited value into pointing out the hypocrisy, right? But nonetheless, it is the hypocrisy. But the problem with that hypocrisy, in my mind, is that it takes the focus off the reasons why we have an escalation culture of political violence and the fact that political violence is a problem. And I don't think that it's like is a problem in just America, but that is any time you have a supposedly democratic country who starts kind of deciding things and making decisions through violence, right, or carrying out retribution or weaponizing the state for political purposes. That is a huge backslide in democracy towards a very different kind of future.
Yeah, and another thing that I think we need to bring up and that's something that we've pointed out on social media, through the Beacon, was that they're not just kind of like the mainstream media is not just trying to mainstream and whitewash Charlie Kirk, like in the wake of this tragic assassination. They're bringing on people like Jack Posobiec, right?
Right. Right.
On CNN, with a chyron that says like we're facing asymmetrical warfare, which was something that he had said. And this is someone who has a long, well documented, again, history of just fomenting violence, dating back to when he was, propagating the Pizzagate
Yep.
conspiracy theory. Never mind his well documented ties, which the Southern Poverty Law Center points out, to white nationalist groups and other
Yep.
extremist elements. So, again, I feel like the media, the mainstream media, not all of them, but there's a large swath of them that are not up to the moment that we're facing right now. They're actually making things even more dangerous by not doing their job. Now, for instance, in the CNN interview, the interviewer asked, whether he felt any kind of responsibility for, this kind of, this polarized state of affairs, and for potentially, fermenting the violence. And he obviously just deflected, but there was no follow up.
Right.
And again, like she could have just mentioned the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which led one individual from North Carolina to drive to DC to shoot up this pizza restaurant, which, according to this QAnon conspiracy, was part of a quote unquote like sex trafficking network run by like the Democrats, or like I think was it John Podesta or something.
Yeah, John Podesta, Hillary Clinton, and like it's like the classic trope of kind of the global elite and the globalist, right? You can weave together like anyone who's like to the left of center and Jews, right? I mean,
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
exactly right. Is at the core of that ideology.
And he just published a book called Unhumans, right?
Yes,
About the
exactly.
left, right? Which praises right wing fascist dictators like Franco and Pinochet, who about praises them and praises how they dealt with the left, right? Which was torture, murder, disappearances, dropping people out of helicopters, which is what the Pinochet regime did in
Yep.
Chile, which you would see Proud Boys members wearing T-shirts also praising
Yep.
that. Like it's all tied together, and it's amazing that there's just absolutely like no like historical or institutional memory, from these, networks like CNN or the Washington Post. I know that they've like reported on this in the past. Like, how do they not remember, or how do they not do the research and the preparation, to put themselves in a position to actually interrogate if they're going to have someone like Posobiec on, which you know, I don't think they should. But if they're going to, they should be equipped to intellectually push back against their falsehoods and rewriting of history.
Yeah, as long as with a big if in front of that.
Yeah.
If they are believers in democracy and the free press,
Mhm.
right? And if they're not, then they should come clean on that too as well, right? I mean, that should be part of the background of that. So okay, so given that, let's kind of bring it home a little bit. What do you see? I mean, I shouldn't say Beacon's already doing this, and what the Beacon is doing right now, but how do you see the Beacon's role and the kind of things that you think are needed to be covered kind of going forward from this moment to play the kind of role that you're talking about as a critical, pull no punches media site?
Yeah, we're going to continue, to do the work and the reporting that has, really driven our mission as a, pro democracy movement media outlet. We're going to ask the questions that the Courier Times, most of the time, won't ask, or the Bucks County Herald for that matter. And we're going to, one, shine a light, on these extremist voices and extremist movements, whether it's Moms for Liberty, which was actually trying to get Turning Point USA chapters in Central Bucks middle schools
Yeah.
as
Yep.
well as high schools, never mind their book banning crusade and their war against, LGBTQ students. to folks like, Right for Bucks, led by Andy Meehan, who once called for, Barack Obama to be lynched on the White House lawn for treason, to MAGA millionaire, local MAGA millionaires in Newtown, right, telling a newspaper in Canada that Democrats hate America and that they cheat in elections, right? One of the things I had written in that in that article for the Courier years ago was, I'll just read a little passage. Quote, there's a cultural rot within this group that attracts, breeds, and promotes extremism. The threat of having Penridge kids fall down the TPA USA rabbit hole is that these students grew up to follow in the footsteps of Bucks County's current cadre of far right conservative thought leaders who are transphobic, who follow QAnon, who call the Proud Boys, quote, patriotic young men, tell newspapers that Democrats hate America, and write columns, J.D. Mullane, that blame feminism for mass shootings, right? And so that's why, you want to protect your school district, from groups like this. And it should be noted that Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick just went to one of the vigils and said that he wanted a Turning Point USA chapter in Bucks County Community College. But going back to your original question, what the Beacon's going to do is continue to do what we have been doing, is just like reporting about not only these right wing groups, but like the progressive and common sense voices within the community, and the solutions that they're offering. And then I think like locally, I think it's just incumbent upon the local Democratic Party to kind of step up and just force the Bucks County papers like the Bucks County Courier Times and the Bucks County Herald to report on this by issuing statements, by organizing their own local events that are dealing with the current events that are happening across the nation, but that also impact our communities directly, like this tragic and awful killing of a man who had really an awful history of just promoting intolerance and bigotry. And again, like you can just look to his own words. There's plenty of video from his podcasts, right?
Mhm.
There's
Yeah.
plenty of reporting out there, that just shows just how reactionary and hateful really Charlie Kirk was. So again, you can stand against this murder and assassination, you can speak out against it, and you can rightfully call it awful and horrible, but that doesn't mean you have to excuse or whitewash Charlie Kirk or Turning Point USA's history, legacy, and current state.
I couldn't put it better myself. I mean, I think that's exactly the nexus of where we are. And can I encourage folks to, this is perfect time. Head on over to the buckscountybeacon.com. Check out all the work that they've been putting out this week, because it's been an invaluable resource. I mean, just this week, for example, got a piece called White House Working to Criminalize Left-Wing Dissent on Domestic Terror in the Wake of Charlie Kirk Murder. This was the piece that I referenced before by Brett Wilkins. Bucks County GOP campaigns on Charlie Kirk and Ukrainian refugee deaths. Kind of documents, kind of lays out kind of the ways that, what's happened in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder and that horrific death of the Ukrainian woman in North Carolina, and how that is being, again, politically weaponized by people right in our own backyards. Or yet another one, why journalists are reluctant to call Trump an authoritarian and why that matters for democracy. Special to the Bucks County Beacon, just published a few days ago too as well. I mean, these are the kind of pieces that we're seeing coming out of the Beacon that are kind of helping us all make sense of this kind of community going forward.
Oh, and I was just going to say, like, in addition to like these bigger picture stories, like we're still kind of ratcheting down on what's happening locally as well, right?
Right. This is what I was just going to say. Is like it's you're far from. I was about to say is like yeah, but that doesn't mean that the Bucks County Beacon is a one trick pony here, right? I wanted to like let folks know like what else are you covering in the Beacon right now? What are some of the other pieces people should be paying attention to?
Sure. I mean, so Pat LaMarche went to a roundtable that was led by Democratic Bucks County State Rep Jim Prokopaic, discussing, potential solutions to, the affordable housing crisis, here in Bucks County and across the
Yeah.
state. And what we've seen in Bucks County is that there's been an increase in homelessness that's been happening. I think this is especially important to kind of, really dig into, because a lot of these people are are working poor and they just can't afford, housing in Bucks County. And then obviously there's some people that are like dealing with like addiction or mental health crises. And then you have like people on Fox News that are saying like he thinks that we should lethally inject homeless people, right? That kind of like dehumanization on the
Yep.
right. Somehow, he's still working, at Fox News. He's still a host there. He's still spewing that kind of like vile hate. And then, we've also been talking about, we'll continue to focus on what's happening with the 287G ICE agreement. There was just a hearing yesterday, and,
Yeah.
and there's been a couple articles out already in the Inquirer and the Courier. We're going to dig a little deeper, but what the judge tried to suggest is that there maybe that the two sides should come to some kind of compromise, right, to quote unquote limit the scope of what ICE was going to, what ICE would potentially be doing. Harron still keeps saying like, even though he signed up, for the task force model, which gives them those broad and sweeping powers, he's not going to use them, right?
Yeah, don't worry, anybody. Don't worry. It's going to be fine. Our services are going to proceed as normal. You won't even notice a difference.
So, Melinda Rizzo is, chasing this down now. And, we're going to be talking to, different advocates within the community to ask them, like, what do you think about, like, for me, it's just like, can you, in good faith, come to terms with some kind of agreement with, Sheriff Fred Herron, our local mega sheriff, and ICE, an organization that, explicitly thumbs its nose at any kind of transparency or accountability. They've essentially taken up the uniform of paramilitaries. They're masked. They don't have any kind of visible identification, but yet this judge wants us to make an agreement. This is just my opinion. I'm really interested to see like what some advocates in the community think about this. But
Mhm.
to put it lightly, it seems penny wise and pound foolish, to make myself sound like an 80-year-old.
Get off my lawn.
But yeah, that just doesn't seem like a good idea. So like that we have school board races coming up. We have just this really kind of like simple series about explaining like what these different row offices do that are up for election in November. Which I think is just like a good, like good service, good civic service piece,
Yeah.
for democracy, to just kind of like educate people about what exactly does the prothonotary do. What are the district attorney's roles and responsibilities. We also just covered a hearing in New Hope Soulbury that was chaired by another Democratic rep, Tim Brennan, about improving civic education in our schools, which I think that's a great idea, and that should be something that you would think would have like bipartisan support
Yep.
moving forward. So we'll continue to focus on the local, state, and national stories that matter most to the communities here in Bucks County, and just kind of like connect the dots to talk about how these national stories impact the people locally.
Yeah, and I think that has been, for me at least, this has been one of the greatest services of the Beacon, because it's not just reporting that, hey, this thing happened, but it's let's put that in context. Let's help to try to understand this, right, in a way that's useful for our community, kind of as they're kind of living our lives, and as we're ideally trying to strengthen our democratic participation in, in our local communities, in our schools, and in our nation, and our state. This is kind of what we're supposed to be doing, it seems like to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, anything else you got going on the Beacon that you want to headline here or preview?
Sure. So two things. First is we're going to be making an announcement about a big hire, and a new addition to the Bucks County Beacon that who is going to help us ensure our longevity and staying power moving forward, to make sure that the Beacon as an institution is here for many years to come. So look out for that. And then,
So this, just to be clear, so this is the announcement that there will be an announcement.
Exactly. We're going to build up the anticipation here. And then we're going to be partnering with the Peace Center for 2 events in late October, on October 25th, which is a Saturday, at 3 p.m. at the Newtown Friends Meeting House, and at 7 p.m. at Salem United Church of Christ. We're bringing in 4 of the authors of this new book, a collection of essays. The book's called Ban This: How One School Fought 2 Book Bans and Won, and how you can too. And so, this is about, the struggle in Central York, right? Where a right-wing, Moms for Liberty adjacent, Christian nationalist adjacent school board banned over 300 resources and books in the district. And all of these 300 books and resources just happen to be either about or written by people of color, which the school board president said was just a coincidence.
Just a coincidence.
Nothing to see here.
Colorblind.
Yes, but it's about the really amazing story about how 2 teachers and a group of students, the 2 teachers, Ben Hodge and Ben Hodge and Patricia Jackson, and a group of students, 2 of whom will be coming to the event along with Ben and Patty, Christina Ellis and Olivia Pittock. They're going to talk about how they organized a campaign to fight against and successfully overturn this racist resource ban. And when they were doing this, they were getting national and international attention, from CNN to The Guardian, to all across the globe about what they were doing. And it shows what building a progressive culture within the community and an organizing and activist culture can actually accomplish. And that starts, in the schools. And so I think, this is something that Bucks County has grappled with. Obviously the one event is in Doylestown that evening. Central Bucks themselves were able to fight against, a book banning campaign by the former far-right school board, and their superintendent, Abe Lucaball, who's now at Centennial. And, even thankfully to a lesser extent in Council Rock, they were dealing with the same thing. Kristen Marcel, who's now a state rep, who was a former school board member, she had voted against including the book by Lois Lowry, The Giver, in 7th and 8th grade classrooms, because she had, quote unquote, read some bad reviews online, which means she didn't even read the book for herself.
Right.
So,
not a hard book to read, by the way.
No, not it's a fun book and a great book.
Exactly.
But yeah, so, and this is, and I think this is a good way to kind of remind people what's at stake in November with these school board races that are coming up, from Penridge, where you're at, to Central Bucks, to Council Rock, to Ben Salem School District. Even though the Moms for Liberty crowd has been a little quieter, and I think they've been doing that strategically because they recognize that their brand locally is pretty toxic after, the Beacon and other local news organizations had been working for years to kind of really just, let these people speak for themselves and show them what they're doing. They're just kind of being quiet right now and not being front and center and visible in these school board races. But that's not, I don't want people to mistake that for that they're not invested in it, because
Right.
They most definitely are. They're just being quiet about it because they know it's a losing issue. They know that across the, political divide outside of this, percentage of far right, MAGA Moms for Libertyites within the Republican Party, most normal people don't want to see book banning. They don't want to see any kind of censorship, against books where that show representation of people of color, LGBTQ students, etc. Because a school is where these people need to kind of, one, be able to have resources to learn about, the history of folks like them, and which is a history of America, right?
Right.
As well as to not feel kind of like ostracized or disenfranchised because of these like, hateful messages and ideologies, that groups like Moms for Liberty or the Independence Law Center, which is the legal arm of the far right PA Family Institute, their agenda to kind of to transform public schools into kind of like white Christian nationalist indoctrination centers.
Yeah, and I also think it's even broader. Even broader too is like this is what an opportunity for people who may not experience these things to grapple with things of people that they may not know, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I go back to like that saying that campaign slogan from Bernie, right, and from AOC, like, are you willing to fight for someone you do not know? Well, public schools is one of the places where we actually get a chance to grapple with other people's experiences too, that go beyond our immediate experience, right? To understand our community kind of for what it is and all its richness and diversity and kind of complicatedness. So absolutely, 100%. And, the Beacon, just like you said, has been really at the kind of spearhead of reporting on this and help us understand what's happening in the community. So folks, listen, well, Cyril, before I kind of like get us ready to close out for the day, anything else you want to leave folks with for the day?
No, I would just say, if you haven't signed up for a newsletter, go to buckscountybeacon.com, sign up for that. So that way you never miss a story that we publish each week. It comes out Saturday morning. So you get a review of the past week's stories, and obviously you can follow us on, Blue Sky, Facebook, or any of the other social media outlets except X, because we've stopped publishing there because it's just turned into unfortunately a right-wing cesspool thanks to Elon Musk. And we'll be putting out information about where you can get tickets. It's just $5 for this event, and I think it's going to be great. And Barbara Simmons from the Peace Centers is helping facilitate this. So hopefully we'll see you all out there, and so that you can also be book defenders, and you can kind of learn different strategies about defending the freedom to read, not only in your kids' schools, right, but they're going after like public libraries as well. So this is an issue that impacts the entire community. It's an issue the Bucks County Beacon has been reporting since we started, and will continue to report on, through up until the election and then through the election, to make sure that we're defending the bookshelves in these school libraries.
100%. Well, everybody, and the other thing that you can do right now while you're over there buying your tickets for the upcoming event, all right, you just head on to buckscountybeacon.com. You click on support the Beacon button. You can become a supporter for today. Right now, you can become a supporter. You could jump in as a monthly entry-level supporter for as little as $1 a month, or get in as a regular supporter, $5 a month, or a yearly supporter for as little as $50 a year. You could even drop a one-time donation to help keep the Beacon's critical lens focused and sustainable. Just go to the buckscountybeacon.com, click on support the Beacon button, and become a supporter today. Cyril, I'm so glad we had an opportunity to sit down and talk today, and look forward to what comes next.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
You bet. This is Kevin Mahoney signing off, sitting in here at the Signal for the Bucks County Beacon. We'll see you on the other side, everybody. Keep up the fight.
This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril Mychalejko, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.